our best to make sure that everybody's heard. Thank you for coming. We're happy to be hosting an educational event about Palestine. We will be contextualizing current events and putting them in the perspective of a long history of occupation and settler colonialism. We hope that you all gain insight and leave this teach-in with an understanding of the occupation of Palestine. And before we begin, we are going to be reading the Berkeley Law Civility Statement. Free speech and academic freedom are foundational values for the University of California. UC Berkeley is committed to the belief that speech we may not like or agree with should be confronted with respectful speech rather than censorship. UC Berkeley's principles of community call for civility and respect in our personal interactions. If you would like to express a point of view that is different from what our guests present this afternoon, you may do so in an area on campus that is open to public free speech. You, of course, may ask questions at the appropriate times. However, you are not permitted to disrupt this event. We ask that you as audience members be respectful of the speakers and students in attendance and refrain from any disruptive behavior. If you attempt to disrupt the event, you will be asked to leave the venue and face possible student disciplinary action.
Here at Berkeley, during most events or classes, we hear a Native American land acknowledgement used only as a formality. And since this event is based off of the consequences of settler colonialism, it's important for us to be intentional with our practices. Land acknowledgements can be a vital tool in undoing Indigenous erasure. However, this is only possible if we allow ourselves to be uncomfortable with hearing and speaking of the part we play in settler colonialism. And that is the point of this acknowledgement. It is to understand the roles we play, and in this room, how we exist as a structure of settler colonialism. That we are actors in a settler colonial project and that we can't just talk about it from a distance. We must address it directly, geographically, and not theoretically. These structures are here now and they're very real, whereas if we think of territorial acknowledgements as a site of potential disruption, they can be transformative acts that to some extent undo Indigenous erasure. I believe this is true as long as these acknowledgements discomfort both to those speaking and hearing the words. The fact of Indigenous acknowledgements discomforts both speaking presence should force non-Indigenous peoples to confront their own place on these lands. Chelsea Vowles from Beyond Territorial Acknowledgements. It's imperative that we recognize that UC Berkeley is built on a land that was still and inhibited by the Mwakama Ohlone people. It was not called Berkeley and they do not call it Berkeley. That is the name of the settler. This land is their original homeland and they never agreed to give up this land. So with that, we ask as you learn about the colonial occupation of the Palestinian indigenous land to keep in mind that settler colonialism is nothing new to history. And we as students of the university possess an obligation to condemn and reject settler colonialism and ethnic cleansing in all parts of the historic and contemporary world, starting with our university. And with that, I would like to introduce our first speaker, Professor Samera Esmir.
Good evening, everyone, and thank you, Roa and Farah, for these opening remarks. Thank you, everyone, for being here today. As we convene here today in the comforts of this beautiful room, Israel is bombarding more than 2 million Palestinians, themselves refugees and descendants of refugees, confined to an enclosed territorial patch measuring a mere 365 square kilometers. Images of destruction accumulate, devastation, wreckage, bodies under and above the rubble. There is nowhere to escape. The strip is too small, too devastated, already unlivable. More than 200,000 Israeli troops are preparing for ground invasion. This round of bombardment is more devastating than any previous one. Some Gazans, in anticipation of their deaths, are posting their last words and pleas for forgiveness if they ever wronged anyone. If we thought there was an empirical threshold to the extent of the Israeli destruction of Gaza, necessitated by the limitation of a military strategy, we find that such a threshold does not exist. When we hear, quote, "I have ordered a complete siege on the Gaza Strip. There will be no electricity, no food, no fuel, everything is closed. We are fighting human animals and we act accordingly," unquote. We are not hearing an Israeli minister speaking about a military strategy that responds to a concrete situation. Instead, we are listening to a settler colony reasserting its mastery over the land and supremacy over the indigenous population. We are in the presence of a conqueror who refuses the revolts of the conquered, demanding that they remain defeated. We are in the presence of a desire to eradicate Palestinians, if not from the land, then from the politics of the land. We are in the presence of a campaign that attempts to destroy what had escaped destruction in earlier rounds, starting in 1948. We are in the presence of a settler colonial desire to obliterate the native. Signs of obliteration first appear in language. Hence, media outlets, states, and international organizations, liberals and conservatives, university presidents and donors have all miraculously lined up to share in a discourse. Its order is clear. It contains no single dignifying or gracing reference to Palestinians. This is not a coincidence. Before they can be obliterated, Palestinians must first be discursively transformed into barbarian monsters. Let us try to be more specific about this colonial, international, and Western media discourse. It does not merely wish to criminalize Hamas for its actions. For that, we have the juridical imaginary of war crimes, of prosecution, of punishments, and examples of such criminalization of both Israel and Hamas could be found, for example, in the Goldstone report, where the criminal perpetrator remains legible. Instead, this shared colonial discourse affects something else, far more reaching than what the legal imaginary allows for. It denounces the very being of Palestinians, their very existence. This order of discourse, which the West, as a moral project, not only as a bunch of states, has already authored about other people, the other people it colonized and enslaved, this order of discourse figures Palestinians as dispensable. This order of discourse figures them as the enemy of all, who must be crushed instead of negotiated with politically. Insofar as this discourse, reinforced by civilized states and liberal media, engenders the wordlessness of Palestinians, its grammar is genocidal. We all know from other histories that the language that constructs the civilian and the barbarian is a language of extermination. One quickly realizes that this production of Palestinian wordlessness is not new. It has been with us for quite a long time in Palestine and elsewhere. Consider the New York Times project of cataloging the horrors that Hamas provoked. A similar project of cataloging the horrors that Israel provoked never existed and is in fact inconceivable. This is not because the settler state violence and destruction are daily, structural, and impossible to enumerate and to catalog. Instead, this is because the emotional response of the liberal West can only invoke horror in the face of quite particular atrocities. The ongoing blockade on the captive Palestinian population does not cause dismay. The bombardment over and again does not trigger sorrow. The siege incites no ethical reflection. The military and settler violence required to maintain the occupation in the West Bank provokes no concern. What explains this numbness, on the one hand, in response to the suffering of the indigenous colonized, and the horror, on the other, when confronted with the pain of the colonizer? Why are the senses so unequally distributed? Is it a matter of double standards, or is there more to this extreme disparity that reverses the background disparity between colonizer and colonized? To what extent is this radical disparity generative of obstacles to the Palestinian struggle? Could it be that so many outside Israel secretly wish for Palestinian resistance to disappear so that, quote unquote, tragedies can be avoided and, quote unquote, the mess can be fixed, and colonial international order can be restored. But isn't the disappearance of Palestinian resistance the beginning of the disappearance of the Palestinians as living, active people? And wouldn't such wished-for disappearance of the resistance reinforce the grammar of obliteration? There are many answers to these questions. One takes us back to the 1967 war, when Israel's victory over Arab armies was received inside and outside Israel as, quote, miraculous messianic. There was also the British support for and facilitation of a settler Zionist state in Palestine. There is the unwavering, of course, American support for Israel. There is the deep affinity between the settler colony in the Middle East and the settler colonies in the Americas, an affinity that we must recall, especially during this Indigenous Peoples Week. But today I want to suggest another answer by staying with the history of the Gaza Strip, the Israeli settlements surrounding it, the making of Israeli territory, and the figure of the Israeli civilian compared to the Palestinian subject. Little remembered is that Palestine did not have an area called the Gaza Strip prior to 1948. There was, however, a much larger area called the Gaza District. During the 1948 war, the Zionist forces conquered most of the Gaza District, destroyed 49 villages, and forcibly displaced the population. Only 365 square kilometers were spared conquest. Placed under Egyptian administrative rule, this stretch of land would come to be known as the Gaza Strip and receive 200,000 Palestinian refugees who would inhabit 8 refugee camps. In 1950, Israel removed those who lived around the camps in the territory that was now Israel's territory, depopulated the Palestinian village of Majdal, and began to encircle the Strip by setting up settlements to border and enclose it. These settlements were the terrain of the events this weekend. Already then, Palestinians attempted to return to their homes and lands. They also attempted armed attacks against the settlements that prevented their return. Israel responded. 1953, for example, saw a major military occupation aimed at containing Palestinian operations targeting Israeli settlements. 1956 saw Israel occupy the Strip for the first time. In Khan Yunis, soldiers rounded up and shot down hundreds of Palestinians. In 1967, Israel occupied the Gaza Strip again and stayed as a land occupier until it became a blockader. Throughout this history, Israel deployed an array of pacification measures against the anti-colonial struggle of Gazans. These included systematic arrest, demolition of houses, economic pressure, and deportations. Rebels were rounded up and dozens summarily executed. Since then, Gaza's camps, even after 16 years of a blockade, continue to be at the heart of resistance. Elsewhere in Palestine, similar military settler operations secured the making of Israeli territory where none existed, resulting in the extreme deterritorialization of Palestine, which is to say, its destruction. For example, despite the widespread destruction and mass expulsion in 1948, nearly 160,000 Palestinians remained on the land which became Israel's territory. They would soon be subjected to a military regime. Plans were put in place to restrict them, confiscate their livelihood, and prevent them from reaching their fields. Live ammunition was used to prevent the so-called infiltration of Palestinians who wanted to return to their places of refuge, from their places of refuge behind the ceasefire lines. Massacres were carried out. The Judaization of the Galilee was pursued. Since then, many settler colonial practices and structures of enclosure, removal, and frontiering have continued to confine the Palestinians, restrict them to small patches of land, and avail Israelis to the rest of the land. Hence, in the West Bank, there are 560 military checkpoints and 260 small ghettos. Armed settlers are everywhere attacking Palestinians. I offer this gestural history of the making of Israel's territory not as a historical context to the current event, but to introduce an argument about the reason for the unequal liberal distribution of the census I started with. You see, once Israel was able to mark its borders, to fortify them with settlements and armed settlers, once it was able to territorialize itself by depopulating Palestinian villages and cities, destroying them, preventing the return of Palestinian refugees, and conscripting Jews from all over the world to populate the new settlements. Once it did everything that was becoming illegitimate elsewhere in a decolonizing world, it could begin to both materialize civilian and civilized normalcy and weaponize it as a condition to be defended. In its name and for its protection, atrocities could be carried out. Key to this civilian normalcy is its supporting institutional condition, a strong state form. Israel has it. It acquired it by force from the Palestinians. The state form has institutions, a professional standing army, a Ministry of Interior, a registry of citizens, and a Ministry of Defense, to mention key institutions. The state is what allows for the distinction between civilian and combatant to materialize, even as national military service is mandatory for all Jewish citizens with some religious exceptions. Next to the state, an Israeli civil society was formed, a civil posture developed, and civil plurality was celebrated. The condition of the possibility of this civilian normalcy was the destruction of the Palestinian existence on the land. Its maintenance required the ban on their return to their land. Meanwhile, Palestinians' claim for civilian status meets many challenges. Palestinian society was destroyed in 1948. The territories occupied in 1967 have been purposefully fragmented, disconnected, and separated by settlements. There is no state form, no standing army, no depth of territory, and no citizen posture. There are many refugee camps instead. Everything that could cultivate civilian normalcy is already targeted by the Israeli occupation as a matter of norm, from homes and schools to NGOs, cultural centers, and universities. But there is more. The civilian ethos as a matter of liberal sensibility requires innocence, political passivity, and lack of movement. In the eyes of the liberal civilized West, the civilian must be pacified, passive, and reject rebellion. The Palestinians as refugees, made by Israel as refugees, as politically engaged resistant subjects, as subjects who lean to their land and aspire to move in its direction, as persons who wish not to settle in an enclosure, Palestinians do not pass the test of this liberal ethos. Their just refusal of confinement, their steadfast rejection of enclosure, their non-despairing hopes to return to the land they have been banned from violate this liberal ethos. Paradoxically then, and I'm beginning to conclude, on the one hand, we have a state with one of the most advanced armies on the surface of the earth, which by invoking the violation of civilian normalcy can mobilize obliterating military forces with the support of most members of the international community. The pain of its civilians is legible and capable of provoking horror. On the other hand, we have a colonized, deterritorialized Palestinian people with no standing army, with a tiny terrain for maneuver, whose members, by daring to resist their settler colonial wasting away, have no civilian normalcy to invoke and to weaponize. Their struggle triggers little international support. On the one hand, we have a self-territorializing settler colonial state built through the ethnic cleansing of the land, which carries out destructive extraterritorial operations to protect its territory from those it expelled and confined. Its operations are endorsed, militarily fortified. On the other hand, we have the expelled and confined people persisting under extreme conditions of fragmentation, who attempt to create an opening in the land by the arriving at it from the edge of the territory, these people are condemned. Such is our cruel international order with its sacred territorial mandate. Perhaps it is time for us, those who do not play the game of states, to stop attempting to restore the international order and stay for a little time with the trouble, the refusals, the just demands, and the sacrifices. Perhaps we can try to make legible a life that cannot but live in a relationship of struggle with the settler colonial hold over the land, a life that cannot but seek an undoing of the frontier, a life that cannot but refuse the conditions of confinement and deprivation necessary to the normalization of the settler colony. To stay with this life is to create an opening, a language, politics, and ethics in excess of the colonial cartography and the international order that enables it. Thank you.
Okay, thank you so much, Professor Smith, for those very insightful and profound words. We're having some technical difficulties with the Zoom, so as I introduce Professor Feldman, they're going to be working with that. Next, we're going to be having Professor Kieth Feldman, the chair of the Department of Ethnic Studies and Associate Professor of Ethnic Studies at UC Berkeley. He's the author of A Shadow Over Palestine, The Imperial Life of Race in America. Professor Feldman received the 2017 Best Book in Humanities and Cultural Studies from the Association for Asian American Studies and was a finalist for the American Studies Association's 2016 Laura Romero First Book Publication Prize. His research program is dedicated to illuminating the intricate connections between race, culture, knowledge, and state power. Currently, his research focuses on the patterns of life, exploring contemporary U.S. visual culture's role in shaping racialization within the context of the Long War on Terror. He is also a co-organizer of the Color of New Media, a working group sponsored by the Center for Race and Gender and Berkeley Center for the New Media that focus on intersections of critical race theory, gender, and women's studies, and translational studies with new media studies. It's my honor to present Professor Kieth Feldman.
Samera. Oh my gosh, incredible. Greetings, everybody. Thank you, Ra and Farhat, for bringing us together this evening. It's such a modest and absolutely essential activity that we can participate in and being in this room together. So I want to begin with an epigraph from a lecture delivered by Edward Said in 1973, which I'll have more to say about in a moment. And the quote is brief. War leaves the major tasks undone. I want to start by acknowledging how we've been moving these last few days through a barrage of images, sounds, and stories of unfathomable loss, unimaginable violence. And I know so many of us have been reaching out to connect with family, with friends, with community from Palestine and Israel and the wider region with dread and fear of what's to come. Major US news outlets are saturated with the most gruesome details of massacres, hostage taking, ordinary lives taken swiftly and without warning. It is a trauma felt deeply with personal, local, familial, and historic implications. Devastating, I think, is the all too predictable mobilization of the Israeli state to inflict on Gaza as a whole ever harsher forms of collective punishment, ever harsher blockades, to bomb and strafe and prepare for ground invasion, to encourage Palestinians to flee to Egypt, to force the further dispossession and displacement of those whose condition since 1948 has been defined by their dispossession and displacement. I watched the local morning news with my kid, and the news shares the daily communiques, strangely enough, from an Israeli cafe owner who lives most of the time in San Francisco. He's visiting his family in Tel Aviv. The news shares his pictures of shelters, of toy and clothing drives for Tel Aviv's residents. He's looking for a flight back to San Francisco, and his brother has been called up for deployment. The news invites me to empathize, to recognize, to identify with this protagonist in this human interest story. Then, as the local news goes to commercial, a video of one of Gaza's concrete apartment complexes crumbles in smoke and rubble without caption or commentary. I shudder at the grotesquerie of it all. These last few days have reminded me of Judith Butler's work on precariousness and grievability. All life, Butler argues, is precarious and warrants support, aid, networks of kin and care. The precariousness of life has been differentially distributed due to long histories of racial capitalism and colonialism. To heed the obligation that the apprehension of precariousness places on us is to move with and through a commitment to interdependence and care. But there is a prior moment, Butler argues. In order to apprehend life as precarious, one must apprehend its grievability. The apprehension of grievability is to grasp that the inevitability of life's loss will have been met by grief, by mourning, by sadness, by anger and rage and frustration, by nausea, by trembling. The ongoing violence of colonial occupation in Palestine, sometimes slowly and sometimes with overwhelming kinetic force, has in the last few days been again inframed as war. The differential distribution of grievability intensifies. The deepening distinction between those lives to be grieved and those lives that are not ipso facto understood as such precisely because they again and again and again fall outside the prevailing frame that enables their apprehension as grievable. It's precisely why I find a gathering like this evening's so important. We have the opportunity together, I think, modestly as it may be, to marshal our critical faculties to reckon with that framing, to frame the framers, as it were, following Butler, who follows Trinh Minh Ha. To do the work of critical inquiry, to provide some context, to shift the tempo of our attention and thought in this devastating moment. So initially, I'd planned to use my remarks to dwell on some contextual reminders about Gaza that don't often make it into the news or widespread analysis. These are reminders I suspect this audience might not need. So let me simply gloss them. That Gaza is one of the most densely populated places in the world. According to the UN, prior to this past week, clean water was unavailable for 95% of the population, and electricity was available on average about 11 hours per day. These are on the best of days. We learned today that Israel has cut off access to food and water and electricity. Prior to this week, 63% of people in Gaza were food insecure, relying on international assistance. Over 80% live in poverty, and there's an unemployment rate of around 50%. 7 in 10 Palestinians in Gaza are under the age of 30, and the median age in Gaza is 19. There are currently 8 recognized Palestine refugee camps spanning the Gaza Strip, large concrete structures with some of the highest population densities in the world. Of the more than 2.1 million Palestinians in the Gaza Strip, 1.7 million are registered with the UN as refugees, whose families were forced into camps built in the years immediately following the 1948 war. We learned today that nearly 400,000 Palestinians are now seeking shelter in schools and hospitals. This is the temporality of the Nakba, ongoing and open-ended. But these brute facts, I think, are readily available. And I wonder whether such reminders have the capacity in and of themselves to move the needle on one's capacity to apprehend lives in Gaza as grievable. Not so much in this room, perhaps, but in the wider worlds through which we move. So I want to shift gears a bit and offer a little story. And I offer this story as a way not only to open a critical inquiry into present conditions, but also to remind us of the intellectual and political traditions available to us and from which we might draw in moments like these. Now, as has been widely reported, Hamas's attack on Israel coincides with the 50th anniversary of the October 1973 Arab-Israeli War. And the story I want to tell takes place in a ballroom in Washington, D.C. in October 1973, amidst a gathering of scholars and students in a time of war. It's the 6th annual convention of the Association of Arab American University Graduates, an organization largely composed of scholars and community organizers that was described by the New York Times in 1972 as, quote, the most influential secular group of Arabs in the United States. The organization had been founded in the aftermath of the '67 war as a multidisciplinary knowledge project focused on educational and cultural initiatives about the Arab world and the Arab diaspora, one meant to intervene in the prevailing Orientalist and Zionist common sense prevalent in the United States. The AAUG put out pamphlets, books, educational films, eventually a journal. It sent delegations to Palestine, and for many years it held annual conferences. By 1973, many members of the organization had been subjected to surveillance by the FBI through a project called Operation Boulder. And soon thereafter, the AAUG faced a series of bogus legal challenges to its status as a tax-exempt organization, what we come to understand these days as lawfare. So back to that October 1973 meeting. The conference theme for the meeting is national liberation and settler regimes, Africa and the Middle East. And it's organized by the AAUG's president at the time, Baha Abu Laban. Scholars are invited to engage in, quote, the study of the internal dynamics of settler regimes and the interrelationships and confrontations between settlers and nationals, end quote. Papers from the conference are collected in the 1974 volume entitled Settler Regimes in Africa and the Middle East, The Illusion of Endurance, edited by Abu Laban and Ibrahim Abu Lugo. The comparative framing for this volume enabled scholars to reveal, in the editor's words, quote, the tendency for settler regimes to move toward exclusivism, exploitation, oppression, and racism. They continue, this is as much true of the Afrikaner regime in South Africa as the Israeli regime in Palestine, of the former French regime in Algeria as the current Portuguese regime in Angola and Mozambique, end quote. In each context, the illusion of endurance could be grasped through both a rigorous critique of power and an attentiveness to liberation struggles near and far. Reflecting on the particular moment in which the conference was taking place Abu Laban and Abu Lugod note, quote, viewed from the perspective of the worldwide struggle against oppression, this war manifests once more the inherent contradictions between colonialism, however garbed, and the basic human rights of colonized people. This volume, needless to say, is an invaluable part of any bibliography of settler colonialism in comparative frameworks. Now, among the conference's plenary speakers is Edward Said, and in my time remaining, I want to dwell on the paper he delivers at the conference. I turn to his paper to surface both how frames of war have endured and how Said thought through, in this moment, in that moment, possible ways to disrupt those frames. So Said says 50 years ago, and it sounds almost as if it were this morning, quote, all of us in the United States have witnessed the sometimes appalling spectacle and sound of media coverage of the present conflict. Most of the time, it seems as if we're watching a football game with favorites and villains, home teams and visitors, or as if we're watching a horse opera with marshals, Indians, and bad guys. Language is completely out of touch with reality. Arabs, always mobs of them, faceless, voiceless, dark, and frightening, are always claiming to have done something. Israelis who look bohemians of some sort are doing things. The interviews are uniformly of some clever glib fellow, like General Herzog, or a friendly infantryman from the Bronx. Bombing, napalming, strafing of Arabs is perfectly acceptable, for is it not with Arabs as with subhuman others that American bombs were designed to deal, keeping American hands clean? How hard it is to watch the silent faces of Arab suffering on the anonymous, ruthless faces of American TV. This, end quote. This is one frame of war. It echoes what Said calls a kind of realism that animates Israel's military approach and is supported by the United States, a realism Said chastises for its seemingly once and for all quality. Quote, the realism of the present situation is that once we beat the Arabs this time, they will never dare come near us again, end quote. But Said continues, can anyone seriously believe that another defeat will make all Arabs stop bothering Israel and go away? Has it occurred to no one to say to those people that if you beat the Arabs this time, the next time will be sooner than you expect? That continued tyranny does not break the will or the back of a people, but that popular resistance grows rather than lessens with every blow, end quote. Said then turns to another kind of realism, one predicated, as it were, on the historical reality in the region, the reality of long-standing entanglements between Palestinians and Jews and Israelis in one another's worlds, of neighbors living in close proximity to one another, ensconced in one another's histories and possible futures. Indeed, here the title of the paper that Said delivers might be important. It's called Arabs and Jews. In many ways, the language is anachronistic. The Arab and the Jew are figures, structural positions, as it were, in today's parlance. We would likely talk of Palestinians, Egyptians, Lebanese, Syrians, and we would keenly distinguish between Ashkenazi and Mizrahi Jews and Israelis. But here, thinking in terms of structural positions, for the Arab and the Jew, Said says, quote, each is the other. In this context of deep historical entanglement, Said advocates for what he calls, quote, a realism that takes in as much as possible of what has happened, of what has been felt and experienced on both sides. It takes in the dense human reality which one side has hitherto denied the other, and it encompasses not only the discovery of this reality, but also the political and emotional pressures of memory, of war, of threats, of humiliation, and above all, of fear, whose impressions on all our spirits are very deep, end quote. Said calls this interhuman violence of a constructive type. And what I take him to mean in this is the difficult work of responsibly reckoning with the grief that one has inflicted on another, the pain and the loss, the foreshortened futures and eclipsed horizons. In my more hopeful moments, this points to ways of shifting the frame through which one apprehends the grievability of Palestinian life, of lives subjected to the historical violence of conquest, colonization, dispossession, and displacement. A historical violence rendered legitimate in a way to manifest a commitment to Jewish safety and security. In later essays, Said would encourage us to reckon with the inextricability and the incommensurability of the Palestinian Nakba and the Jewish Holocaust, the former an ongoing condition, the latter a spectral, if foundational, trauma. Such work lays the ethical foundations for ending the occupation, ending apartheid, and advancing justice and equality for all. It is absolutely essential work. In 1973, though, in the midst of the October War, Said sees much darker clouds. Quote, "A major and dangerous consequence of this war is that these reckonings might not take place. One reason," he goes on, "is the hindering violence of war itself, which gives a combatant the sense that all is solved or solvable by war. A second is the setting of this war, which is not simply in the Middle East, but in the media, on the world stage, amid great power rivalry, and up and down the great, even unlimited dimensions of history. In other words, the danger in this war is not that it will spread to include more participants, but that it will spread to include more elements and more perspectives that will obscure the vision, impede understanding, and finally blunt one's humanity," end quote. Said closes by addressing his colleagues in the AAUG, imploring all in the room to work to forestall such an outcome. 5 decades on, dark clouds remain, and the conditions are absolutely dire. Institutions like ours have an obligation, a responsibility to do what we can to forestall such dire consequences, and to do that in the research and the teaching that we do, in the forms of study that we enact, like we're enacting this evening, in the worlds we recall, we make available and create. The question becomes not only can we put in that work, of course we can, but even more, can institutions like this provide us the conditions to do so? Thanks.
Thank you, Professor Feldman, for those powerful words and references to the legendary Edward Said pen. Next, we'd like to introduce Hiba from Palestine Public Health. Hiba is a Palestinian Muslim American and daughter of immigrants. She completed her undergraduate degree at UC Berkeley with honors while majoring in public health and minoring in global health. She also completed her 4+1 MPH graduate degree at the UC Berkeley School of Public Health. Throughout her studies, her work focused on diverse equity work for marginalized communities here and abroad. She has worked in collaboration with researchers at institutions like Harvard and UCSF. She has also collaborated with diverse organizations like the Neighbor Program in Sacramento. Furthermore, both her honors undergraduate and master's thesis were on health inequities in Palestine. She's the founder and CEO of Palestinian Public Health, an organization she first founded here at UC Berkeley. Hiba was acclaimed at UC Berkeley School of Public Health Changemaker, and the founding story of PPH was released across the school's media outlets. Hiba, if you could please come up. Thank you so much.
Hello, everyone. Thank you so much. It's an honor being here today to advocate for the Palestinian people and their rights and health and well-being. And before I begin, I want to affirm for the Palestinians in the room, and a message to any professors or administration who might be on the call is that to take care and note of your Palestinian students whose health and well-being is always heavily damaged when they hear news of the genocide and massacre of their families across the Gaza Strip and the West Bank. And so if you're feeling feelings of rage and sadness and despair, they are very valid. And so my presentation is actually going to be a slideshow, and I'm going to be presenting on how the military occupation and settler colonialism destroyed Palestinian health. And so the plan is, I have a slide on what Palestinian public health is, just in case you want to get involved and follow up after. Then I'm going to go through a few definitions that are crucial when you discuss the Palestinian struggle, some background, which the other presenters have done an amazing job at, so we won't spend too much time there. The health stats, because everybody cares about the numbers. But the most important part that I hope you take note of, and if you're going to pay attention during any part of my presentation, is the structural and systemic inequities in Palestine. And because behind the numbers, there's a story, and that story is crucial to our understanding of why we see what we see in the Gaza Strip today. Then there's some visuals. I'm sure everybody wants to know how can you help, so some aid, building resilience and future directions, how this relates directly to you, and a call to action. And so Palestinian Public Health is an organization dedicated to global equity, mentorship, and advocacy. If you would like to contact us after this, this is the slide, but I'm not going to spend too much time going into it. And so some definitions. So the first one is apartheid. When we refer to what's happening in Palestine, we refer to it as apartheid, right? This refers to a system of the implementation and maintenance of a system of legalized racial segregation in which one racial group is deprived of political and civil rights. We also call it settler colonialism, and this is really important because oftentimes the distinction between the government and the settlers is made, and it's crucial for us to understand that there is no colonization without the settlers. There are no settlements without the settlers. And this specific type of colonialism in Palestine is one where the indigenous people of a colonized region are displaced by settlers who permanently form a society there. So that's crucial. And then occupation of 1948, I'm sure everyone in this room is familiar with that. And the last major key point is that we believe, Palestinian Public Health and myself, that health is not possible without autonomy and equity. And so, again, I'm going to set the scene a little, but, I'm sure you guys are aware. We start with the year of Nakba 1948. This was a massively traumatic event that Palestinians deem as a Nakba, or the catastrophe that consisted of the ethnic cleansing and genocide of the Palestinian people, the destruction of their homes and the seizure of their land, livelihood, and autonomy. And this has been for over 75 years. And I do want to just mention that there were catastrophes before 1948 that catalyzed, that led to what we saw happen with the Nakba, including the Balfour Declaration and such, and grabs due to imperial interests. And one of the most unfortunate outcomes is the destruction of the Palestinian healthcare infrastructure. And so Palestinians have not only been stripped of resources, but more importantly, their ability and their autonomy to take care of their country and their people, both socially, physically, and mentally. And so we have one of the world's largest displaced populations and thousands of refugees living in camps in the Gaza and the West Bank. And this is crucial because a lot of the Palestinians living in the Gaza Strip were from the West Bank, we're from Jerusalem. So they are internally displaced as well. And so we're going to go into the numbers a little bit. So as you've been hearing, the Gaza Strip is the largest open-air prison in the world, and it's experiencing an Israeli air, land, and sea blockade, where it's very hard for resources to come in and out. And the estimated population is over 5 million. And in Gaza specifically, we have over 2 million Palestinians, and in the West Bank, we have over 3 million. And I really want you to take note that over half of the population are children. And when you hear a number like that, it's crucial to think why. Why is over half the population children? It's because they're not living to be adults, right? So overwhelmingly young, 7 out of 10 are under the age of 30. And Gaza has the highest percentage of pediatric war injuries in the world. And ages over 60 only comprise 6% of the population. Then you get into the life expectancy, right? And we see inequities there. Females are around 75 years and males 73 years. And compared to Israeli life expectancy, they're around 82 years. Then you have food insecurity, and over 2 million, you have over 2 million inhabitants in the Gaza Strip, and close to half of them, so that's like 1 million people who are food insecure. You have high rates of malnutrition, anemia, and micronutrient deficiencies due to the occupation. And then you have water, right? Access to water is a human right, and over 90% of Palestinian water is heavily contaminated and unsafe to drink. And over a quarter of diseases in Gaza are caused by the wash crisis in the Gaza Strip. Electricity, I'm sure you've seen what's happening in Gaza right now, but aside from what you're currently seeing, in general, Gaza only has one functioning power plant that is routinely attacked. And on a good day, they'll have 4 hours of electricity on a good day. And you have economic inequities as well, where you have high rates of unemployment. Over 44% of the Gaza Strip is unemployed. High rates of poverty and non-communicable diseases that are also increasing health costs, right? So you have stark inequities, and there have been multiple indicator cluster surveys that have been done in the Gaza Strip, and this is basically a survey by UNICEF, and it's designed to internationally compare estimates of key indicators that are used to assess the situation of children and women in areas including health, education, child protection, and such. And they find that the infant mortality rate in the occupied territories is 12 per 1,000. And this is basically number of infant deaths per 1,000 live births. And the under 5 mortality rate was 14 per 1,000. And you compare this to the infant mortality rates for Israelis, and you see 3 per 1,000 and an under 5 mortality of 4 per 1,000. So I did want to take a moment to highlight the current stats, right, in Gaza. And I do want to make a note that when I was making the slide, the amount of times that I had to go and change the numbers because they're increasing. So these numbers are not even reflective of what the statistics are in the Gaza Strip right now. You have over 1,000 Palestinians killed, including over 300 children, over 5,000 Palestinians injured. The majority of the injured are women and children. And again, there is a story behind that, right? They are the ones that are mainly in the homes when they are attacked. There are over 22,000 homes destroyed, 10 medical centers destroyed, 48 schools destroyed, mosques, buildings, markets, and more destroyed. Life-saving medical care, water, electricity, food, and access to healthcare infrastructure is cut. And displacement, we go back to the idea of displacement. There are no bomb shelters in Gaza, so when you are displaced, you do not have a shelter or a hotel or a place to seek refuge. UNRWA provides a lot of the refuge in the area, right? And their services are also, their schools are also being attacked right now. So you have over 170,000 internally displaced that usually would try to shelter in 88 schools across the Gaza Strip. And so we see numerous violations of international humanitarian law, attacks on healthcare infrastructure, the murder of healthcare staff, reporters, civilians. Just recently, over 4 paramedics were killed, 6 healthcare workers were killed, over 8 healthcare facilities were damaged, and 9 ambulances were attacked. I really highly encourage you to look into the Geneva Conventions, and when you scroll through the articles, you will recognize that Israel has violated almost every single one. And specifically Article 18, right, healthcare infrastructure should be protected. And Article 20 that talks about the protection of hospital staff. That is not happening in the Gaza Strip, and it's not happening across Palestine. Over 2 reporters were killed and over 7 were journalists. With the blackout as well, they're not able to report and tell us what's happening. So they quite literally don't have access to the outside world through every means possible. And the headquarters of the private Palestinian telecommunications company affecting the landline, telephone, internet, and mobile phone services in Gaza was also attacked. So that's also a violation, right? Because according to the Geneva Conventions, you should be able to at least contact your family during times like this, and they are not. So the UN and numerous human rights organizations have stated that the occupation and siege on Gaza is a violation of international law and human rights, and it prevents Palestinians from achieving the sustainable development goals. And I did want to highlight that in 2015, a UN agency did predict and report that Gaza would be unlivable by 2020 due to the wash crisis and food shortages, and we are now in 2023. And so the policy closures on Gaza are one of the most vicious manifestations of Israel's attempts to crush Palestinians. And this slide is not specific to currently, but again, currently is not what is just important. The context is important, and in terms of illness and disease, mainly across Palestine, you're dying from non-communicable diseases, including cancer and cardiovascular disease. And the probability of dying between ages 30 and 70 from these are 26% compared to 8% in Israel. And I did want to just highlight that to look into what happened during COVID in Palestine, because it will highlight the inequities Palestinians have experienced for decades, including how the PA was not able to control and stop the outbreak due to a lot of structural inequities, including the Israeli military and economic control, shortages of medical and financial resources, crowded cities and refugee camps, poverty, food insecurity, and the fact that Gaza only had 120 ICU beds, and those are for the critically ill. And Palestine as a whole only had 343 adult ventilators for a population of close to 5 million. And so I want to get into the most important part, which is the social determinants of health and structural and systemic barriers. And this is key because, like I said, behind the numbers, there is a story. And so these are just some barriers across the West Bank that prevent adequate access to healthcare and medical resources, including demolitions, homes being uprooted. And oftentimes these notices are not even received, right? They're blown away, and Palestinians will report that the only way they know their home is being uprooted is they wake up to the sound of hearing their homes being destroyed. And they also can't afford the building permits. We saw this also in Sinwan, if you look up Sinwan, that they were destroying homes to build a theme park. And something else is that a lot of these homes, to begin with, are built by nonprofits, right, NGOs. And so you're also losing money and the efforts that were put in to even try to provide support. And close to 1,000 Palestinians are facing forced evictions, forced displacement. Over 200,000 Israelis live in illegal settlements in occupied East Jerusalem, many built on private Palestinian land. And these homes are also taken by settlers. So again, the idea of settler colonialism. Just from the start of 2023, you have demolished at least 47 Palestinian buildings in occupied East Jerusalem, helping with the ethnic cleansing. And so there's a lot more there, but I want to move on to the checkpoints. And there's different kinds of checkpoints across the West Bank, including permanent checkpoints, flying checkpoints, hundreds of checkpoints on the main and side roads through the West Bank and near settler colonies, where Palestinian vehicles are stopped. Passengers are detained, interrogated, and fined. You also have permanent barriers. These are like metal bars, locked gates, and these are often what Palestinians, if you don't have the right license plate or permits, you'll have to walk through. So aside from the humiliation and the mental toll, it's very harmful, and it's very stressful, and I mean, I think that's self-explanatory. There's also agricultural checkpoints, right? So this really prohibits the Palestinian farmers from accessing their land and their food, and there is a whole food justice movement in Palestine. So if you are interested in that aspect, I recommend you look into that. License plates as well, green license plates for cars registered to holders of the PA identity, whereas the yellow is for 48 Palestinians or those holding Israeli citizenship. And so just to put it into context, if you have like a 60-mile journey from Jenin, which is in the northern West Bank, and you're trying to get to Ramallah, it can take up to 5 hours because you have to pass through 4 checkpoints. There's racial profiling, a massive mental health toll. And you know, this is violating UN Code of Conduct and Geneva Conventions as well. I did want to highlight the apartheid wall, which has been constructing since 2000 across the West Bank, that prevents Palestinian farmers from accessing their land, that's illegally annexing Palestinian land and separating them from villages and from each other. And the International Court of Justice concluded that Israel's construction of the wall violated a number of international legal principles, including not following the Green Line. that's essential for preserving territory to create a viable Palestinian state. The right of the Palestinian people to self-determination, individual human rights, and the annexation of territory by force. So back to the Gaza Strip. Again, this is the largest open-air prison in the world. What is happening in Gaza is deemed as collective punishment, which is a violation, again, of international law, Article 33 of the Fourth Geneva Convention. It limits goods, services, and people that come in and out. It restricts entry and exit of goods, people, and services through a dual list that prevents entry of medical equipment, medicines, and other supplies. The delays have affected the entrance of supply chains from organizations like the World Health Organization, as well as the Ministry of Health, and other needed partners. This affects the supply of things like X-ray machines, magnetic imaging scanners, oxygen cylinders, and also materials needed for limb prosthetics that, when people are it prevents basically all the medical resources you can think of. And 40% of essential medicines and 18% of essential medical supplies at the central drugstore of the Ministry of Health had less than a month's stock. And so they depend on outside medical referral. And this is even before what you see happening in Gaza. So you can just imagine the situation now. And you need a permit to even be able to exit the Gaza Strip, right? So this is how they keep Palestinians enclosed in Gaza, and a third of applications for patients over 70,000, which is about 30% from Gaza, were delayed or denied, and they weren't able to reach their hospital appointment in time. And it's reported that cancer patients who were not able to reach their appointment had a 1.5 times more likely to die than if they were able to reach their appointment. So it doesn't even come down to the disease that you have. It comes down to whether you're able to get a permit and you're able to reach your appointment. And so these are just some quotes. I believe that these are the headlines that we should be seeing on the media from healthcare workers and from organizations that are on the ground in Gaza working with the people. And I just wanted to highlight the middle one where a manager from a Shifa medical complex in Gaza, which is the largest hospital entity in Gaza, is saying that hospitals can't be called hospitals anymore. They have to be transformed to public cemeteries. And they are saying that the morgue in Shifa is overflowing. So you're probably wondering, like, okay, like ambulances, hospitals, healthcare workers, like there's no way. Yeah, there is way. They are systematically attacked as well. There is no protection for healthcare workers. They also have to get work permits as well to enter the territories. And so these are just a couple of facts that you should know about the situation. And that 64% of permit applications were not approved. So they can't even reach their populations to aid them. Mental health, there's a huge toll with it. And you're probably wondering, like, is there any infrastructure for mental health? They barely have the infrastructure for fatal injuries. And yeah, so I'm gonna move on just so we make time. But these are just some visuals. When you want to educate yourself about what's happening, I recommend you watch films, you read books, you follow Palestinian accounts, and this is a really great film that usually during my presentations that I would go through an activity, but I recommend that you do this on your own, where you watch the film. It's by 10 Palestinian children who will narrate to you their lives in the Gaza Strip, and it remains true. And so this one is just some key facts that a child named Muhammad highlighted. And something I did want to highlight is that a poor person is defined as someone who lives on less than $4 per day. But Muhammad receives only around $1 a day. So, and that's the situation for most Gazans. Again, this is another way that we can think about what's happening when we try to think about the public health inequities in Palestine. This is the way we should be looking at it. We should be taking into account the structural violence before anything else. So aid, so the Palestinian healthcare infrastructure is composed of non-governmental organizations, the Ministry of Health and nonprofit, aid, and the work of the United Nations Relief and Work Agency. And a heavy burden is put on the Palestinian Ministry of Health, which lacks the resources or medical personnel to handle the heavy load of casualties and the need for medical assistance. The healthcare infrastructure is fragmented and destroyed. And I do want to highlight, like, the United Nations Relief and Work Agency, which does a lot of crucial work. Again, their facilities have been attacked. And so there's also a lack of funding. If UNRWA specifically, Trump did pull pulled their funding, and I think Biden reinstated it. But that's just showing you that it's a very unstable situation. Oh, I'm sorry. This was the slide. I was supposed to be there. But these are some limitations and recommendations as well. The prevalence is underreported, the gap in research. So like you see with Gaza, with electricity and the reporting is being cut, we don't have accurate numbers of the disease or the illness in the region or the casualties. And so some recommendation is at the very least, the protection and safety of healthcare infrastructure and the free movement of people and services, granting access to physicians and medical personnel. And there needs to be more research on prevention rather than just intervention. So building sovereignty, when we think of how we can help, it's not just about aid, it's about building sovereignty. And so this was just an example of the way you can do community-based work by collaborating with people on the ground and making sure that you're addressing their needs. And this was a project by Palestinian Public Health for food equity, but it was very involved with the people on the ground. And these are some pictures. And so I would recommend you take a picture of this slide. These are some organizations that are trying to provide relief on the ground in Gaza. And so that's, I think, commonly what people think of when we hear aid, which is absolutely needed and wonderful. But I also think you can aid the cause by being educated and raising awareness through your privilege and your power and your voice. And so these are some social media accounts. The first one is ours. And we share things on health and equities all the time. But the other ones are some of those organizations listed on the top, as well as some that report on live updates. These are some books that you can also read in your free time. And again, the movies, and this is obviously, there's so many other great resources as well, but this is a good start. How this impacts you, this is a global responsibility, and you have a unique responsibility, power, and skill set that you can use to make a big impact. Whatever field you're entering, I 100% it does relate to Palestine in some shape, way, or form in terms of the inequities that we face. And so I just want to really voice that you should use your power and your privilege to advocate for marginalized communities and those facing oppression. And so I just want to leave you with a call to action that aside from the temporary aid that we have in the Gaza Strip and from donating, the only way that we can have help for the Palestinian people is to regain autonomy and an end to the occupation and siege on Gaza that prevents Palestinians from having the ability to live a healthy and safe life. Thank you.
Thank you, Hiba, for your presentation. I would like to introduce next Professor Hatem Bazian. Professor Hatem Bazian is a scholar of religion, politics, and globalization, whose field specialties include Islamic law, Awqaf and Fatwa texts, classical Arabic, Palestine, Islamophobia, diaspora and comparative immigration, American law and society, Arab and American studies, post-colonial and decolonial studies, multicultural and cross-cultural studies, and international relations and globalization. Dr. Bazian is also a professor in the departments of Near Eastern and Ethnic Studies here at UC Berkeley, and he's an advisor to the Religion, Politics, and Globalization Center here. Please welcome Dr. Bazian.
Thank you. Assalamu alaikum. First, I want to start by just sharing the news from yesterday. One of my employees, I chair the American Muslims for Palestine, Zarifa Baroud, learned that 6 of her family members were wiped out. The youngest of them was 9 years old. So when we speak about Palestine and Palestinians, it's not only a side note or an interest, it really impacts the life, the well-being of people. In the 2021 attack, I had 2 of my students here on campus, Al-Qawlaq family. They lost 21 members of their family of Israel's attack. So the notions of that we could separate ourselves from what's taken place over there is something that cannot be undertaken. And to also see the mad dash that people have on a daily basis to resort to some of the most despicable display of Islamophobia, the most despicable jingoism, using terminology that we thought belongs to the 18th century, but the creativity of racists can always shock you. They never miss an opportunity to come back and center racism again. You could have as much discussions and difference about what Palestinians do or don't, but using racism, Islamophobia, trying to pass your point of view by this demeaning and dehumanization is just unacceptable, especially at this university where we think we are, quote, progressive, but I think we left the P out, and we have not finished the word itself. So I think this is just for me to start. This is an essay that I just posted last night. I said it's Fanon's Palestine and the borderline, the colonial borderline. For us, we cannot think of Palestine by thinking that Palestine history began on October 7th, which everybody right now insists. So the terminology like we had with 9/11, pre-9/11 and post-9/11, as if history begins on 9/11. Again, if you ask people, there are many different renditions and understanding. So Fanon's insight on colonialism, oppression, and the division between the colonizers and the colonized resonate profoundly when examining the complex and enduring struggle in Palestine. His writings shed light on the intricacies of a struggle where a colonial dividing line has been etched deep into the landscape and consciousness of the region. In exploring Fanon's perspective on the colonial experience and applying it to the Palestinian context, we gain a deeper understanding of the dynamics that have shaped the Israeli-Palestinian colonial entanglement, not conflict. If you speak of conflict, you erase the colonial entanglement. From the physical barriers of walls, checkpoints, and daily violence to the social, cultural, and psychological divides, Fanon's framework provides a valuable insight into the ongoing struggle for justice, freedom, right of return, sovereignty, and then peace in Palestine. Often people insist to speak of peace before addressing all the other elements in colonial context. Palestine's geographical world is a colonized one, divided into two. The colonized are the indigenous Palestinians, make no mistake about it. And the colonizers are the Zionists and all their Western allies. In this geography and per Fanon's framing, the dividing line, the border, is represented by the military barracks, bases, concrete walls, and the daily sniper stations positioned all around the Gaza Strip borders and in the West Bank. Thus, in the Palestinian colonial experience, everything revolves around the power of the Israeli colonial defense force, settlements, settlers, and persistent structured violence. Occupation and colonial structure is a structured violence that touches every element of the population that is colonized. The colonial world is a world divided into compartments, nowhere more palpable than in Palestine. Here, the division is stark and painfully evident, with Israeli settlements carving up the West Bank, encircling the Gaza Strip, and creating isolated geographical enclaves, effectively segregating Palestinian communities and imposing an apartheid system. Everybody says the two-state solution. Which state? The one in Mars or the one that is asking us to possibly construct in the moon? There is no such thing as a two-state solution. Oslo was signed in 1993. When Oslo was signed, there was 130,000 settlers in the West Bank. Let me repeat, because every American spokesperson speak about the peace process. I think it's a mispronunciation, but that's okay. The Europeans speak about the peace process. In Oslo, 1993, 130,000 settlers. Today in the West Bank, there are 750,000 settlers. meaning that almost sevenfold increase under peace. Palestinians will say, we'd rather have the occupation pre-Oslo than the current period, but this is not to insist on it, it's a metaphorical question. Palestinians are confined to fragmented geographical territories, mirroring the physical separation experienced by every Palestinian family. And freedom of movement is severely restricted by checkpoints, walls, and fences. This division, driven by an occupying force, mirrors Fanon's observation of colonialism's tendency to compartmentalize and separate, creating a stark divide between the colonizers and the colonized. In Palestine, the struggle for justice and self-determination continues as Palestinians seek to break free from the compartments imposed upon them and build a future founded on justice, dignity, and freedom. Fanon speaks of the distinctive nature of the colonist and the colonized sectors and how distinctively and diametrically are different in every facet. Israeli areas are built up and well developed with green lawns, lush parks, swimming pools, plenty of water, mind you, stolen from Palestinian aquifers, paved roads, large shopping centers of every kind, and every conceivable amenity at hand. The colonized sector is a sector built to last, all stone and steel. In the Palestinian context, the phrase takes on a profound meaning. The Israeli settlements in the West Bank and outside the walls of Gaza are fortified with walls and fences, constructed with unyielding stone and steel, with constant technology to detect the colonized intruders or any aspect of their life coming close to these fences. These imposing structures not only divide communities, but also serve as a physical embodiment of the power imbalance in the region. The settlements symbolize an unyielding colonization that shows no signs of relenting. If you don't believe this, as Ben-Gvir and his unleashing of the settlers in the West Bank, no one actually put a Palestinian flag on any monument when the Hawara pogrom took place a few months back. Nobody actually mentions where the Palestinian dies. We die nameless, faceless, and unmourned. It's a sector of light and paved roads where the trash cans constantly overflow with strange and wonderful garbage, undreamed of leftovers. In stark contrast to the impoverished and beleaguered Palestinian communities and refugee camps. Israeli settlements enjoy access to modern amenities, internet, 5G, and Palestinians are still barely getting 2G. They are all illuminated with streetlights and adorned with well-paved roads, while Palestinian neighborhoods often experience power shortage if and when they are permitted to have fuel to run the only power station, and deteriorating and often bombed infrastructure. Gaza has been bombed 7 times. What type of bank of target does Israel have other than the skulls of civilians? 7 times. How many more targets can you identify? The cash rans constantly overflowing with strange and wonderful garbage is a metaphor for the excess and opulence paid for and supported by Western powers that characterizes the colonist sector in stark contrast to the structured deprivation faced by the colonized Palestinians. The colonist feet can never be glimpsed except perhaps in the sea, but then you never get close enough, says Fanon. The Israeli settlers who occupy Palestinian land often remain distant and isolated and insulated from the harsh realities faced by the Palestinian population. They enjoy a level of security and comfort that is elusive to their Palestinian neighbors. Can anybody contemplate the question, do Palestinians deserve security? Do the Palestinians have the right to secure themselves? What about the security of the colonized people? Nobody contemplates that question. They are actually to accept being the subject of the security of Israel that is constantly being formulated on their expense. This divide is particularly evident in Gaza and made worse by a 17-year-old siege, where Palestinians endure a blockade that restricts their movement and access to medical care and most necessities. Just think about it. 2 million people as we speak have no water, no electricity, no food, and no access to the outside world with communication. And our governments are supporting this, in essence, also sending weapons to bolster this position. They are protected by solid shoes in a sector where the streets are clean and smooth, without potholes, without a stone. The Israeli settlement sectors enjoy the privilege of smooth and well-maintained streets, a stark contrast to the infrastructure in Palestinian areas. This contrast reflects the structural inequalities and disparities in resources that are inherent in the occupation and the unlimited financial and logistical support extended by the West to Israel. The United States provides almost $4 billion. And as Israel began to bomb Gaza, the United States allowed Israel to have access to 6 depository of armaments inside Israel, which means that the United States is almost giving free hand for Israel to continue its operation. In context of Palestine, Fanon's words resonate with a haunting familiarity. The native quarters, the refugee camp, and the besieged Gaza Strip are inhabited by people whose lives are marked by dispossession, despair, erasure, and unmourned death. Palestinians are unmourned, just like Iraqis were unmourned, like Afghans are unmourned, the Vietnamese were unmourned. All the colonial subjects are unmourned, and therefore they are part of that continuum. In Palestine, you're born into a reality where your very existence is contested, where your home can be demolished and your future is uncertain. Palestinians die anywhere and from anything, whether it be the consequences of occupation, the lack of basic necessities, the lack of medicine, or the relentless settler and IDF violence that disrupts their daily life. The cramped living conditions, the overcrowded refugee camps, and the constant threat of displacement paint a picture of a world with no space and a life just waiting and expecting certain death. Sometimes arriving quickly, but more often it is a slow one, for sure. The hunger for basic essentials like food, water, shelter, and electricity is a daily struggle that snuffs joy at every moment. The Palestinian experience is one of perpetual subjugation, where people are forced to crouch, cower, and remain on their knees in the face of oppressive Israeli policies and non-stop colonial violence, rendering them collectively imprisoned but not defeated. Imprisoned but not defeated. In Palestine, the colonial occupation is marked by the visible, often militarized division between Israeli settlements and Palestinian territories, enforced by a pervasive system of checkpoints, walls, electronic surveillance, and heavily fortified military outposts. We say about Israel as a startup country, it's also the surveillance country of the world that learned, perfected, machinized, marketed surveillance globally. And we could include some of the most oppressive regimes benefiting from this surveillance. The Israeli police and military play a significant role as the enforcers of this division, serving as instrument of control and oppression. They act as intermediaries between the settlers and the indigenous Palestinian population, reinforcing the power dynamic of colonial occupation. This observation underscores the central role of security forces in perpetuating colonial rule, maintaining a palpable sense of separation, and suppressing the aspirations of Palestinians for self-determination and justice. Fanon's words offer a poignant lens through which to view Palestinian experience, where the colonized subject gaze is indeed marked by a complex array of emotions. It's a gaze colored by a profound sense of injustice and longing for what has been forcibly taken away. Palestinians living under the shadow of occupation often looked at the colonist sector with a mix of envy and resentment. And I know many in the Israeli, pro-Israeli writings, they speak about the Palestinians' envy and so on, but that's not what I'm speaking about. This envy isn't merely a coveting of material possession. That is not what the Palestinians are looking with envy. Right? This envy isn't merely a coveting of material possessions, but a deep yearning for the freedom and rights that have been denied to them. It's a desire to sit at the table of self-determination, to sleep soundly in the bed of sovereignty, and to shape their own destiny, preferably without foreign interference. The colonized Palestinian is, in essence, an aggrieved figure, pained by the privilege and control over his land, villages, fig and olive trees that an external colonial power, Zionist settler colonialism, has usurped. The colonist, in turn, is acutely aware of this aggrieved gaze. They understand that the Palestinians, despite the harsh conditions imposed on them, continue to nurture dreams of repossessing their homeland, the villages, the olive groves, and regaining control of their shattered lives. This realization fosters a sense of unease, defensiveness, and a sadistic violence among the colonists, who often interpret this as longing as a threat to their position of dominance. They may even perceive it as an intention to take their place in a broader sense, not just in terms of property or material wealth, but in the quest for self-determination and justice. Indeed, it is daily reality for every colonized Palestinian to harbor dreams of reclaiming their rightful place, a place that has been occupied, fragmented, marginalized for far too long. Palestinians' dreams are filled with lemon, apricot, fig, and olive trees, with water springs crisscrossing the fields that were stolen from them. The colonized Palestinian never stopped dreaming, for it what makes every morning possible despite the darkness of Zionist colonization. It is a testament, and it should be celebrated, to the resilience, determination of a people that refuses to surrender their hopes, even in the face of daunting odds, persistent adversity, and a Western world, which we are located in, that it intends to clean its own historical racist, anti-Semitic, and Islamophobic records by funding and authorizing the shattering of Palestinian bodies and dreams. And that is the fundamental issue that we need to understand. Cleaning the Western record of racism, anti-Semitism, Islamophobia on the skulls and bodies of Palestinians. And that's what should be protesting and calling for it to stop. Thank you.
Thank you. That was, there's no words for that. That was absolutely incredible. Thank you very much, Professor Bazian. For the final speaker tonight, we have Professor Makdisi, Ussama Makdisi. He is a professor of history and chancellor's chair at UC Berkeley. He was previously professor of history and the first holder of the Arab American Educational Foundation Chair of Arab Studies at Rice University in Houston. In 2012 to 2013, Professor Makdisi was an invited resident fellow at the Institute for Advanced Study in Berlin. In April 2009, the Carnegie Corporation named Makdisi a 2009 Carnegie Scholar as part of its effort to promote original scholarship regarding Muslim societies and communities, both in the United States and abroad. Professor Makdisi was awarded the Berlin Prize and spent the spring 2018 semester as a fellow at the American Academy of Berlin. And he's also been awarded an accolade of awards for his many publications. Now introducing Professor Makdisi.
Thank you, and thank you, Farah, and thank you to all the students here who have organized this teach-in, and thank you to my fellow panelists for all the honestly, the extraordinary presentations. And I'm sorry it's taken, well, here we are, almost 2 hours. I don't know how much more anyone can tolerate of this extraordinarily sort of important, but at the same time profoundly difficult material. I don't really have, honestly, much to add in terms of the facts of what my colleagues said, beginning with Samera and ending with Hatem, except to reinforce and reiterate the main point that they made, which is that the decontextualization and the dehistorical